Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest presentation of the Friends of History First Wednesday Lecture Series. I'm Ben Woodbury, and I will serve as a co-host today. These monthly lectures are being provided free of charge by the Friends of History on behalf of the New Mexico History Museum and through donations from our audience. These funds go directly to support the lecture series and, more importantly, the History Museum's programs and exhibits. Today, we are happy to welcome as our co-host for this presentation, Dr. Tom Dillehay, who is a noted anthropologist and a senior fellow at the School for Advanced Research. Tom will introduce our speaker for today's presentation. Our speaker is Dr. Michael F. Brown, Emeritus President of the School for Advanced Research. He will speak on the School for Advanced Research, 1907 to 2025, a brief history of New Mexico's oldest research center. And now here's Tom Dillehay to introduce our speaker.
Good day, everybody. My name is Tom Dillehay. I am a senior fellow at the School for Advanced Research and also an anthropologist who works in South America. And it's my privilege to introduce not only a distinguished colleague, but also a good friend of mine, Dr. Michael Brown, who is an anthropologist who most of his career he's worked in South America with Amazonian cultures and societies. He is the President Emeritus of the School for Advanced Research here in Santa Fe. And prior to his 10-year appointment to SAR, the School for Advanced Research, he was professor for 30 years at Williams College. Michael has a very distinguished career as a social cultural anthropologist, ethnographer, working in the Amazon, in South America in general. He's the author of several books, published many academic and popular articles as well, book chapters on Amazonian cultures, alternative spirituality, medical anthropology, social movements, policies related to indigenous peoples, cultural, intellectual property, and also some work with the indigenous peoples in and around New Mexico as well. One of his most famous books, and one I read many years ago, is called Upriver, The Turbulent Life and Times of an Amazonian People. I've known Mike since the mid-1970s as a colleague and a friend when we were working together in Peru. And I moved to town here in Santa Fe about 4.5 years ago, and I've been a senior fellow at SAR since then. And I have seen many of the accomplishments that Michael has achieved as president of the School for Advanced Research, making it a more interdisciplinary institution, bringing in high quality individuals as scholars, and essentially helping to put SAR on the global map. So it's not just this institution that is operating in New Mexico, but nationally and internationally as well. And it's my great privilege to introduce my colleague and friend who's going to present the School for Advanced Research, 1907 to 2025, a brief history of New Mexico's oldest research center. Mike, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Tom, for that generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. As you'll soon learn, the SAR, the School for Advanced Research, as it's called now, and I'll talk about the name changes that have occurred over its history, is a complex institution that has a deep history in the U.S. Territorial and state era of New Mexico. So I'm going to give you a quick sprint through that and talk about where SAR is today. I served as president for 10 years. It was a great privilege and an honor, and I'll give you a sense of what I learned in that time. So let's just go ahead and I'll show you some slides. Let me begin with some scene setting here. It's hard to imagine in 2025 what Santa Fe was like in the early 20th century. I just looked up what the population of Santa Fe was. It was about 5,600. in 1900, and New York City at the same time was 3.4 million. So although we have the oldest state capital in the country, it was a tiny fly speck of a place. And I just want to show you a few slides of what it looked like in the late 19th and early 20th century. Here's the San Francisco Street in 1887, view of the plaza in 1895, four unidentified Pueblo governors around 1900. And this is one of my favorite photographs, a dance parlor, dance hall in 1900 in Santa Fe. I have no idea where it was, but it's a great photograph. So in this period in the United States, a lot of intellectuals, academics were starting to sort of shift their focus from the great cultures of Europe, the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, and so on, and really shifting their attention to the deep history of North America, as well as Central and South America. And so the two important figures in the history of the School for Advanced Research are Alice Cunningham Fletcher, who was an East Coast-based intellectual, an early anthropologist, someone who's kind of dropped out of the genealogy of anthropology. And it's too bad because she was really a pioneer. She actually did field work with the Sioux. She was served as a special federal agent to the Miwok in California. She had an ongoing relationship with the Peabody Museum at Harvard, and was really an unusual person. And she and Edgar Lee Hewitt, who may be more familiar to some of you, who was an educator and the president of what was then called the New Mexico Normal School, which was later New Mexico Highlands University, just contacted the Archaeological Institute of America to try and convince them to establish a school of archaeology in Santa Fe. The AIA, which SAR is still a founding member of, I guess, was founded in 1879, and was well established with a focus of archaeological research in Europe and elsewhere. But the idea was to train archaeologists at a time when archaeology was just emerging as a scientific discipline. And there was a lot of controversy about it. There were members of the AIA in New York and elsewhere who thought it was kind of crazy to make Santa Fe to establish a school of archaeology in Santa Fe, despite obviously the rich pre-contact history of New Mexico, but it just didn't have the kind of resources that are associated with that sort of thing. But Fletcher and Hewitt carried the day, and so SAR was established, then called the School of American Archaeology, was established in 1907, and immediately began working to train archaeologists in the methods of archaeological research, especially excavation. In Edgar Lee Hewitt in the field in 1907, he obtained a degree, an advanced degree in archaeology in Switzerland. So he was a trained archaeologist, though obviously the systems that were used at the time look kind of crude from the perspective of contemporary archaeology, but it was about as systematic as you could find in that era, keeping in mind that archaeology hadn't really established itself as a discipline at major colleges and universities. And in 1909, the territorial legislature allowed the School of American Archaeology to use the Palace of the Governors as its home base. But by 1917, SAR decided to spin itself off as a private organization, and that came about in part where New Mexico was a state then, of course, and the public-private organizations were, my understanding is, were not allowed under the terms of the New Mexico state constitution. You either had to be part of the state system or a private organization. And so in 1917, SAR reinvented itself as a private not-for-profit and changed its name to the School of American Research, which is a broader kind of vision of what it was all about. And the SAR was very important in a lot of things that people don't realize. For example, SAR organized the first Indian Fair in 1922, which was the precursor to what's the contemporary Indian market, which is the most important single market for selling Native American arts. But meanwhile, Hewitt and others were being trained as archaeologists. Here's a wonderful picture of their role in the Mesa Verde excavation. This is A.V. Kidder, who later became a very prominent archaeologist. Here's the School of American Archaeology Board of Directors in 1909. One of the interesting things you'll see, and I'll mention this, is initially men, aside from Cunningham Fletcher's role, it's a very male-dominated institution, and that's one of the things that's changed over time, has been the incorporation of women at every level, including the board of directors. Here's a field school, and there are some prominent women in that picture, but I want to note especially Sylvanus Morley, who's, I believe, on the left sitting, who later became director or president of School for American Research after Hewitt passed away. Jesse Nussbaum, who's well known in town for a number of things, including making furniture, some of which we have at SAR, and so on. Hewitt was involved with restoration work at Chaco Canyon into the 1920s. And I love this. This gives you a kind of sense of how important but tangled the relationships were between SAR and the state. So you can see, and Hewitt himself ran a number of institutions. So not only was he the president of SAR, he also directed at the same time, the San Diego Museum, was chairman of the anthropology department at UNM, and also helped to establish the State Museum. So you see this sort of tangled set of relationships, which led to all kinds of complications later on, though clearly the trajectory was for SAR to be recognized as a standalone, not-for-profit organization. And it must be said at this point that we receive almost no state funding for what we do, and a modest amount of federal funding. So it's private donors and our endowment, which has been accumulated over the years, that allow us to maintain and execute the programs that we're famous for. The Indian Arts Fund also was established and involved members who were associated with the board of SAR, and that later became the core collection for the Indian Arts Research Center at SAR. Hewitt, this is a wonderful set of pictures that anthropologist Bruce Bernstein made available to me. Hewitt believed strongly in trying to educate Native Americans, and he organized a concert at what later became Fort Marcy Park, and you see a pianist, and I don't know who the pianist was, playing classical music for Native Americans and a larger audience in 1926. J.P. Harrington, who's a famous linguist at the Smithsonian, was connected to SAR, used it as a home base for his linguistic research with the Tewa. I'm not sure which community this man was from, but he worked very closely with Tewa people on understanding the Tewa language. So one of the things that's typically said about SAR is that it kind of lost its way a little bit as archaeology became absorbed by research centers, major universities, University of Arizona, UNM, Stanford, and elsewhere. There was a bit of a mission drift. Before I get to that, I want to mention the White sisters. The White sisters, Elizabeth White and Martha White, were the daughters of a famous newspaperman, Horace White, who was also a financier in New York. They were quite wealthy, and they fell in love with Santa Fe on a trip across the country. The story was that they were motoring across the country and stopped in Santa Fe to get their hair done in 1922, and they ended up buying what later became El Delirio, the campus of SAR, after both of them had passed away. But they were very involved in the social life of Santa Fe. This is Ms. White in the 1950s. She later did serve on the board of SAR, and she left the estate to SAR when she passed away in 1972. This is what Garcia Street looked like in the 1920s when they built their estate. And there's some early pictures of the estate. Um, and it hasn't changed all that much, except that you can tell that the neighborhood is much more built up than it was then. And it really took a vision that these women could have lived anywhere. They could have lived in London, Paris, Chicago, and they picked Santa Fe, and they fell instantly in love with it and became major figures in terms of advancing the reputation of Santa Fe. Some historians think they had a significant role in helping to formalize what came to be called Santa Fe style. So they were among those in the Anglo elite who were worried that after statehood it would end up looking like St. Louis or Kansas City or something like that. And so they worked really hard to sort of foreground traditional Pueblo style architecture, which you see today in the campus of SAR. Here's a short film, silent film of the movie that was taken in 1929. You can see what the campus looked like at that time. Their parties were famous. This was the living room. It's now called the Dobkin Boardroom at SAR. And you can see an orchestra playing in the balcony, which we've been able to replicate a few times. So there's not a lot of headroom in there. I think you have to be pretty short to be comfortable as a musician in the balcony. So as I said, SAR drifted into a period where it kind of lost its sense of where to go. The finances were very tight. And in 1967, the SAR Board of Directors, or better, Board of Managers, as it was called then, did a national search for a new director with the hope that someone could really re-energize and reinvent SAR. And they hired a young archaeologist named Douglas Schwartz, trained at Yale, currently then teaching at the University of Kentucky, who came in 1967. And in many ways, Doug, who passed away some years ago in his 80s, really was responsible for the SAR that we know today. This is a picture of him shortly after arriving in Santa Fe. He was a field archaeologist, excavated an important site near town in Arroyo Hondo, also worked in Grand Canyon and did important work there. Here's Doug later in life, 2016, doing a tour of the Arroyo Hondo site, which is now owned by the Archaeological Conservancy. One of the things that he instituted early on, you see in 1969, just only a couple of years after he got here, were advanced seminars, which consisted of bringing together typically 10 scholars to spend a whole week woodshedding on a particular topic and then publishing their results. And this is my favorite photograph of one of the very early ones, New Perspectives on the Pueblos. And I have to say, just as a personal aside, that Alfonso Ortiz, who's right here, was from Oquehwingue Pueblo, later be recognized as one of the most significant Native American anthropologists in the country, is probably the reason I'm an anthropologist today. He took me under his wing in 1969 and asked me to be his research assistant. I was a financial aid student at Princeton University, and he liberated me from mopping the floors of the freshman commons at the similar rate of pay, and then later helped me and other students at Princeton work at Rough Rock School and the Navajo Reservation near Chinle. And then, ironically, right next to him, to his immediate left, is Richard I. Ford, who's was my doctoral dissertation supervisor at the University of Michigan when I was a graduate student. Dick worked and continues to be involved with Oquehwingue Pueblo, and he retired from Ann Arbor to SAR, where he lives today. And there are others. Doug Schwartz is in the front row on the right side from your perspective. And I knew about half of these scholars, and the book New Perspectives on the Pueblos, which came from this seminar, was really instrumental in rethinking Pueblo society. But you can see this is a more recent seminar. You can see it's a much more diverse array of people. Women are well represented, minority scholars are well represented, and I think that says a lot about the changing nature of cultural anthropology and archaeology in the United States. And I've participated in two of these myself, and they're really they're extremely unusual in the field. Typically you do 2 hours at a convention or something like this. This is 5 days of working really hard on issues. You have to come to the seminar with your paper already written, a draft, and then it gets kind of vetted and commented upon by the other scholars and gets rewritten for the final publication. Here's another group. I think we've had something like 150 of these now, 50 years, more than 50 years later. So, SAR today, this is the campus now. Obviously, thanks to the miracle of irrigation, it's a lot greener than it was in the 1920s when built by the White sisters. The president's office, which I had the honor of occupying for a decade, is shown in this photograph. This was originally a dining room. The altar screen you see in that picture, it was sort of awkward sometimes because I would do these webinars from that room and it kind of looked like it was a religious organization or something because there's this altar screen. But the altar screen is from a Guatemalan church that was destroyed in an earthquake. And Sylvanus Morley, the archaeologist, who was a Mayan archaeologist, somehow got it to Santa Fe, and it's sort of the centerpiece of that room. There's a working fireplace right there. It's a handsome room, and every day I worked there, it was a pleasure to be there. This is what was formerly the living room and now the Dobkin boardroom, where we use for all kinds of things, board meetings, obviously, but also parties, lectures, and so on. There have been some more recent changes, and I may be able to say some things about it that have to do with our shift to electronic presentations, which was driven very much by the pandemic and the need to continue to communicate with our members by means other than in-person contact. And that's been transformative. So we've got a couple of $100,000 of electronic equipment in the room, which we've tried to keep as discreet as possible, but it's really important that we've vastly expanded our audience through webinars and other electronic means. This is the view from the office after some snow, which I sure wish we could see more of this winter. SAR, because we occupy a historic campus, we spent a lot of time working on making sure that the buildings stay in good shape, which is no small thing because many of them are really a traditional adobe architecture. And if there's a roof failure, and as a matter of fact, I think we replaced at least one roof every year of my 10 years as president. The rain can do terrible damage, so we have to really stay on top of the roofs and other things. And one of the things that we enjoyed the most was restoring what we believe is the last standing corral in Santa Fe, which is SAR actually has two properties. It has one, the main campus, which is roughly 15 acres, only half of which is developed, and on Garcia Street. But up the street on the left, there are two houses which were occupied by Jack Lambert and his wife. And he was a cowboy, very well known in town, supposedly rode his horse into the bar of La Posada. Or no, it was La Fonda, the La Fonda bar one time. I'm not sure that's a true story, but it's a colorful character. And the horse corral there had really begun to collapse. And so in 22, we restored it with the approval of the H board in Santa Fe. And we're pleased. And you can see it as you drive up to the top of Garcia Street on the left. Over the years, we've had more than 200 resident scholars, typically 5 or 6 a year. We actually celebrated last year the 50th anniversary of the resident scholar program. So another feature that was instituted by Doug Schwartz during his 36-year presidency was a system of fellowships that would allow people to come to campus for 9 months and work uninterrupted on projects, typically book projects, or for pre-doctoral students, their doctoral dissertation. And I benefited from that program in 1989-90, finished a book called War of Shadows, with a co-author who's an Argentine, now an American anthropologist. And you get a sense of again, the diversity of the scholars who've come through. One of the things we're proudest of is that in the last 4 or 5 years, 3 of our scholar alumni have been winners of the National Book Award in non-fiction literature. And that's a very impressive record for a small institution in New Mexico. And in fact, Jason de Leon won this year, and he will be in town to speak in February about his book, which has to do with border issues. We also published, I think, I've sort of lost track of the number of books, but something like 250 titles. You'll see the top, so the middle rows are the advanced seminar books. They're co-published with the University of New Mexico, and there are also standalone monograph titles that we've published over the years. Typically, they focus on Southwestern issues, but I think in the last 30 years or so, as our mission has become more global, there's a lot more about global issues. By the way, I should mention that when SAR celebrated its centennial in 2007, the board decided to change the name from the School of American Research to the School for Advanced Research. That reflected the fact that the work shifted or broadened from American issues, which is to say Southwestern, Central American, South American, to more global research. And it was felt by the board at that time that the name was a better reflection of the growing ambition of SAR. Here's some of the titles. You get a sense of the range of these. Wenda Trevathan's book, Costly and Cute, Helpless Infants and Human Evolution, Wenda is currently a senior scholar at SAR and is working on similar issues along with Karen Rosenberg. Writing Culture is one of the most influential books in anthropology from the 80s and 90s. So it gives you a sense, and we continue to publish on Southwestern archaeology on a regular basis. In fact, Patricia Crown, who's the editor of Women and Men in the Pre-Hispanic Southwest, is a former scholar and is now serving on the board of directors. I haven't had time to say much about the Indian Arts Research Center, but I'll do so now. Those of you who've seen it know it's one of the most spectacular collections of Southwestern Native American art in the country, especially because of the way it's presented, which is open storage. So you really get to see things. They're not hidden away in the basement somewhere. And I'd say for the last 2 decades, the program has shifted towards a much more open relationship to the Native peoples whose communities have produced this amazing art. It's mostly post 1890 to the present day. There's not a lot of pre-contact material in the collection. There's a little bit. There have been some repatriations over time, and we're constantly contacting or in conversation with Native communities about things that they might like to see repatriated to them. But thanks to support by private foundations, we've been able to really set a new standard for integrating Native perspectives to the collection. So we've been on an annual basis, we've been bringing in appointed representatives, communities, in this case, Acoma Pueblo, to review every item in our collection. In some of these cases that involves thousands, or certainly many hundreds of individual items, which these local community experts are invited to comment on, to explain, to describe the significance of, and so on. All that information is collected. It may be translated if it's in a native language, as it was in this case, Keres. And then all that data is presented to the community. If there are dimensions of it that they feel shouldn't be in the public domain, then they're allowed to keep them, but we remove them from our electronic records. And so what we're moving towards is to having the most detailed and ethnographically rich collection of or data about our collection of any museum in the country. When they look at the original records, something like the pot that's there being held by Brian Valle, who was then director of the IARC, he had to resign to serve 3 years as governor of Acoma Pueblo, which he did with distinction, leading the Pueblo through the pandemic. very difficult time for the community. That information, if that pot that we're looking at now might have said originally, the record might have said Oya, pot, Acoma Pueblo, 1923 or something like that. And now it's just page after page of information about how it was made, what it was used for, what the designs meant, and so on. So it's been a major. I mean, SAR has really set a standard, a very high standard for the curating of Native American art in our collections. Here's another case of two gentlemen looking at them and taking notes on material that they were reviewing from one pueblo. I think this was from, I'm not going to guess actually which pueblo they represented, but it's painstaking work. I mean, it takes days and days and months. And we provide transportation and lodging funding for these native experts when they come to the IERC collection. We also have native interns who are learning the museum trade, and many of them have then gone on after a year at SAR to work in major museums, including the Smithsonian and the American Museum of Natural History. As I said, we'll also sponsor a number of small conferences focusing on how to sort of leave behind the colonial traditions of curating Native art and bring Native voices to the foreground, and to be much more sensitive to the spiritual significance of some of the items that we curate. And finally, I'd say a part of SAR mission that I took a lot of pleasure in and spent a lot of time focusing on was just our public, keeping our public informed. We have about 800 to 900 dues-paying members, but the number of people who come for our events is much greater than that. And so SAR, and this predates me, and I'm sure will postdate me under Morris Foster's leadership, and I'll say a little bit more about him in a second, was really to bring the best thinkers that we can afford to bring to Santa Fe and they're covering all sorts of areas, not just anthropology and archaeology, cultural history, that sort of thing, but also contemporary topics, including, and let's see, the next one shows a Lansing lecture. We've done several of them. This was Elizabeth Colbert, who's a writer for The New Yorker, who's published on species extinction and climate change. And we had, I think, 700 people at that talk. And we also, by the way, we also do field trips, discussion salons, and mini courses. In fact, SAR has just announced a number of summer courses, sort of 5-day events for members on various topics. This was probably the biggest single event we did. Is Henry Louis Gates Jr. And his co-author Andy Curran from Wesleyan University speaking at the Lansing about the sort of origin of the whole notion of Blackness and what its implications are for contemporary American society. On the left is Chelsea O'Wary, who's a former scholar who I asked to be the moderator for the event. She was thrilled. She said her mother was ecstatic because Henry Louis Gates is so famous. In fact, he had a hard time walking from the hotel to the Lansing because he was stopped so many times by people who wanted to take pictures of him, wanted selfies with him, but he was pretty good natured about it. It was a great event. We've done field trips, as I mentioned. This was one to the Amazon, and it was really amazing. Our leader for that was Anna Roosevelt, who's right here. Very distinguished archaeologist of Amazonia. Right next to her is Glenn Shepard, who is also a cultural anthropologist who works in Peru and Brazil. Here's noted archaeologist Steve Lexon on one of our trips to Chaco Canyon. I think we do about one of these a year. We could probably do 5. It's just that the season is fairly short there. It's either too hot or too cold. So the window for our field trips is brief. So, but they're always popular and they always sell out within hours. I mentioned the importance of the boardroom for social events. This is one, this is just our holiday party in 2017. And this, as I mentioned, we've gone to electronic communication, especially during COVID. The interns actually did these very informal but well attended Instagram live talks with various artists in their studios, all native artists. Here's just a picture of the Indian Arts Research Center vault. I say the high point for the Indian Arts Research Center was the Grounded in Clay show, which is still on the road. It's just wrapping up in Houston at the Museum of Fine Arts, headed for St. Louis, Illinois, or Missouri, I should say. And we opened here at MIAC, but then went to we had 11 months at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. This is the book, the published collection, again, entirely curated by Pueblo people who were allowed to pick the pots that they wanted to talk about and to write their description of the pots and of their significance. And it got reviews in all the major magazines that cover such things. This is from the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and others. It was a great moment for the Indian Arts Research Center and SAR. Here we are. I was in New York when this banner went up. They took down Van Gogh and they put up Grounded in Clay, and it was pretty exciting. Here's just a shot of the exhibition. It was beautifully done. This was one of my last events. This was a jazz concert by a Navajo trumpet player, Delbert Anderson, at Site Santa Fe, and we had a good crowd, and it was really a lot of fun. And then I interviewed him about how it is. We don't think of Navajo musicians as being all that interested in jazz, and he talked about his history of commitment to jazz, and I think he's really an emerging star in the jazz world. So a couple of closing comments. SAR has a long history now, 118 years. Our small size and our private status allows us to really move and change with the times, as we have over the long history of the organization. We've changed our name twice. We've shifted our mission to accommodate the changes in our society. We're right in the heart of Indian country. The Pueblo people, Navajo, and others are our neighbors. And so I think that makes it our approach to dealing with indigenous communities very different from that of other organizations. Santa Fe is a city that loves to learn about history, especially the Southwest, and which is probably why you're watching this webinar. And so that's a huge advantage for us. And we have this great historic campus that is a very attractive feature. People come to see the campus all the time. We have self-guided tours, and we do also guided tours of the campus, as well as the Indian Arts Research Collection. I'd say we're working under the leadership of Morris Foster, who became president in July of 2024. After a long career at Old Dominion University as a senior administrator, he's a Yale-trained cultural anthropologist who's worked with Native communities and written about them. He's working hard to expand our programs and to adapt our campus facilities. We need an expansion of the Indian Arts Research Center, which is running out of space. And there are other things that SAR is working on to bring forward its mission. As I said, we're very committed to deepening the equitable relations with Native communities in the Southwest and beyond. And digital programming has become an important part of the mission. And I know that Morris and the staff are working really hard to make these events much more polished and professional. We've really come a long way, and I'm sure that process is going forward. So thank you for listening to me. I'm going to hand things off to Tom and Ben, and I'll be able to answer some questions if they have any. Thank you very much.
Michael, thank you very much for an incredibly informative and entertaining presentation. I was really struck by not only the history of SAR and your in-depth knowledge of it, but also a lot of the photographs. I have a couple of quick questions before we hand the questions and answers over to other individuals. In the early photos, I was really struck by the denuded landscape around the campus. I mean, it looked like a prairie rather than a forest. So could you speak to that? And second, bringing it into modern times, how does SAR relate to the city of Santa Fe today? We talked about how it relates nationally and to a number of other entities across the state, but also to the city.
Well, yeah, my understanding is that the things look so denuded because the immediate outskirts of Santa Fe had been grazed very heavily and also logged for firewood and construction. So I think what you're looking at just reflected, in fact, centuries of heavy, certainly 100 years of heavy human use. And I'm just always amazed by the vision of the White Sisters that they would have found this to be such a congenial place when it looked so forbidding. And they were very committed to the community. They were also very canny real estate investors, really, and they bought a lot of the East Side and founded something called the DeVargas. I think it's called the DeVargas Development Company or something like that. And they donated the land for the wheelwright. They donated the land for the National Park Service building, which very few of us have seen, but I'm told it's one of the largest adobe buildings in the United States. And it's up on Old Santa Fe Trail. And they were very generous. Actually, one thing I should have mentioned is that Marcy Street, sorry, the Fort Marcy land somehow was acquired by SAR and was donated to the city for purposes of a park. And while I was president, the city attorney contacted me and said, well, we have a problem because the deed of gift says that alcoholic beverages cannot be served at Fort Marcy. This is going back to the 1930s, if I'm not mistaken. And that would void the gift unless the board was willing to modify that. And so we had a hilarious conversation at the board meeting about that. We'd had a really hard time with the H board. I mean, not a hard time, but it just delayed a long time just to do this restoration of the corral. And so we were wondering whether we should keep the city twisting in the wind for a couple of years while we debated the sale of alcohol at the ball games of the Fuego. And so the SAR is just and in fact, I'm also told, and I can't verify this, but I think it's true that SAR also donated the land for the governor's mansion, and that some governor decades ago had decided that the governor's mansion was not adequate for, I don't know, the dignity of his position, and he wanted to put that on the market. And the fact is, the White Sisters were very canny in real estate, had included reversion clauses in all these donations. So if the city had, if the city had sold it, or if they'd abandoned it, then it would return to SAR. And we'd have to figure out what to do with it. Fortunately, that didn't happen. And as soon as our attorney notified the state of that situation, that whole thing went away. So it's, I mean, I think of my own personal vision was that, especially that a state capital without a major university, because for historical reasons the university ended up in Albuquerque, there was a really important role for institutions like ours, which were focused on public education, and we took that seriously. I know my predecessors and my successors take that role very seriously, and just to make available to this town, high quality information about history, about culture, about archaeology, and so on. And I think I can't imagine an SAR that isn't committed to being deeply involved in that aspect of civic life in Santa Fe.
Thank you, Michael, for filling in more of the history of SAR, and specifically as it relates to the city. It seems like SAR has left a really strong footprint, not only across the discipline in New Mexico, but the city itself. I will now pass the word to my colleague, Ben Woodbury, who probably has a question or two. Thank you.
Michael, I really want to thank you for this most informative and interesting presentation. I particularly, among the many things that I enjoyed from the presentation were the photos that you were able to provide, many of which we don't often see, and it certainly adds flavor to the both the history of SAR and to life in Santa Fe over the years. Certainly, your talk certainly has enhanced our understanding and appreciation of the exceptional work and intellectual advancement SAR through its programs has made possible. I understand you have an anecdote which you'd like to share, and we could proceed with that, and then I had a couple of additional questions.
You know, I mentioned Hewitt. His nickname was El Toro, and I think that reflected the fact that he was, a leader in some ways, a dynamic leader, but also a bit overbearing. And one of the stories, and in fact, because he had his hands in so many different organizations, not just in Santa Fe, but in Albuquerque, UNM, and in San Diego. Will Schuster, when he created Zozobra, the story is that he put a bow tie on Zozobra because Hewitt wore bow ties, and it was a way of kind of making fun of, let's just say, the pomposity of of Edgar Lee Hewitt, who got burned up as gloom every year. So I don't know whether that's true, but it's a charming story, and it says something about, again, to speak to Tom's question about SAR and Santa Fe. I mean, we're really a serious, important part of the history of this city, and something that I know that SAR and the board are very proud of.
Well, thank you. Michael, that's the most interesting anecdote, and certainly highlights the varied connections that SAR has had with Santa Fe, and ultimately the contributions it has to making this a cultural and arts center. I had a couple of additional questions. I'm particularly interested, you were very thorough in the presentation. I wondered if you might want to highlight a couple of additional things, such as the public program, which you were personally committed to during your tenure at over 10 years at SAR.
Yeah, I should say that, I have even though I was only served as president for 10 years, I had a long history with Santa Fe, going back to my college years when I'd pass through Santa Fe on my way to work on the Navajo Reservation during summer vacations, and visit Alfonso Ortiz. And so one of the things that strikes me about Santa Fe coming back, especially after a long career as a liberal arts professor, was that the city's credibility as a center of the arts is unquestioned. Visual arts and music are extraordinary, between the opera, the Chamber Music Festival, and so on. As an ideas city, it seemed to me there was room for growth, and that's one of the things that motivated my focus on the public programming and more diverse public programming, and so on. The challenge, of course, is that our venue is fairly small, and so we essentially were outgrowing the venue. So we depended on access to venues like the History Museum Auditorium, which in the third year of my presidency, we essentially outgrew, and I had to turn away dues-paying members from some lectures, which was a very, disappointing thing to have to do. So we do use the Lensic on occasion, but then that's such a quality, it's such a big hall that you really have to have 400 or 500 people to justify the cost and the scale of the room and so on. But it also seemed to me, I think I've got bragging rights on a couple of things. Like, one of the first lectures that I put together was to bring in a professor named Nick Bostrom from Oxford University in the UK to talk about artificial intelligence and the dangers of artificial intelligence. And I remember some board members, they thought, well, really good talk, but come on, that's at least 30 years off or something like that. Well, it turns out to be something that's in the front page of every newspaper almost daily now, and it was only, let's say, 9 years later. A similar one was I met an anthropologist who was working for Nissan, sort of unusual industrial anthropology, on helping them develop self-driving automobiles, autonomous vehicles. And she gave a really fascinating talk, which talked about not just the technical challenges, but the human factors associated with self-driving vehicles. And again, I had friends who said, well, really cool talk, but come on, man. I mean, that's 20, 30 years off. And we now have self-driving vehicles in cities like San Francisco and Phoenix and elsewhere, and I think it's in our future. So there was a kind of futurology dimension to this, as well as forward looking as well as backward looking, and we tried to mix it up. Staff and I would spend a lot of time trying to find really good presenters who could talk about a range of things. It's one of the most fun parts of the job, I have to say. But again, I think that reflects my background as a teacher of undergraduates at a good college, and I see 0% chance that aspect of SAR is going to be diminished in the coming years. It's the only problem is that high quality speakers can be very expensive. And so trying to make the economics of that work is a challenge. But we try and find the talent, the people who don't charge $25,000 to come speak, or who are willing to come for a lot less than that because they're sort of on the, they're on the make and they want to get the word out. And so that's part of the fun part of the job, is the talent spotting that's required to make that work.
Well, good. Well, thank you. I mean, clearly, the vision of SAR is well reflected in the time that you were there, and continues to bring a lot, not only to our community, but also to the nation as a whole. So I want to thank you. I've always been a fan of your publication program. It was integral, but particularly your public publications. David Grant Noble was usually the editor, and it was my introduction to the Southwest and pre-contact Southwest, and really integral to that. I don't know if you had anything additional to add in terms of that. I know it's a wide range of publications, both academic and more broadly.
Yeah, it's a fair question. I have to say, I mean, all of my books have been published by academic presses, right? So I'm personally and professionally committed to that. On the other hand, being at the administrative side, and I look at the financial spreadsheets and I go, oh my gosh, why are we in this business? And it is true that academic publishing is, it's challenged right now. It really is a difficult field. We're going to keep doing it. But it gets harder every year because of cost issues and the changing natures of the market. So we're starting to explore, at least investigate, what's called open access publishing, which is essentially giving away some of the titles for free, but which is the direction that academic publishing has gone in, especially in Europe. And in fact, a lot of European scholars, if they receive government money, are obliged to publish on an open access basis. And we would love to do that. But you can imagine, it isn't free to make a book or distribute a book, even electronically. And so that's kind of one of the challenges that SAR is going to be dealing with going forward.
Well, I'm sure the community will greatly appreciate your efforts to carry this forward. Do you have any final comments you'd like to make before we wrap up?
No, other than to say, and I probably even haven't done as good a job as I could have to just talk about the many ways that SAR and its various iterations has been woven into the history of New Mexico. I mean, I kind of soft pedaled the archaeology side of it, but in fact, almost every major archaeological site in New Mexico had an SAR connection. This is back in the day, but I should say, when you actually bought archaeological sites. In other words, you would buy the property and excavate them. And with only one tiny exception, all of them have been turned over to the state because we no longer have any interest in managing them or protecting them, which involves important work. And so that's one way in which SAR, the archaeologists who really cut their teeth at SAR, thanks to SAR, have played an important role in understanding the prehistory of the state. But also many of our scholars, we have one designated Native American scholar position, and I have to say that just about every major Native American scholar now in anthropology and history has been a recipient of that scholarship, and some young ones coming along are benefiting from it today. That's also true of the artists too. Unfortunately, I didn't mention that we have three annual Native American Artists Fellows who come for shorter periods of time, and most of them started out when they're very young and kind of finding their footing in the art market, and now many of them are doing exceedingly well, and that's something we take great personal pride in. They're not all from the Southwest. Some are from the Northwest, Alaska, other places, Hawaii, but certainly the impact has been primarily on artists living in and near Santa Fe.
I wonder, let me try again. Thank you again, Michael. It's been absolutely a wonderful time as you share your knowledge and experience and hopes for SAR. As you know, the lecture is pre-recorded, so our audience have not been able to ask you questions in real time. I want to thank you for your willingness to take questions via your email, which is shown below, and to further carry on the dialogue that we've had today. For our audience, if you would like more information about the School for Advanced Research, check out their webpage shown below. And in closing, a reminder to our listeners to visit our webpage, friendsofhistorynm.org, where you can rewatch this lecture and other Friends of History First Wednesday lectures, covering a wide range of topics about New Mexico and more broadly Southwestern history. Click on the lecture series link at the top of that Friends of History homepage, then go to past lectures to see the list. If you wish to learn more about our upcoming lectures and more broadly the Friends of History, we encourage you to join our mailing list by emailing us at the address below. Finally, we request that you consider making a donation to the Friends of History through our webpage so that the Friends of History can continue to support programs at the New Mexico History Museum. Just go to the donation panel website, again shown below. And thank you all for contributing to the Friends of History over the years. We look forward to seeing you in the months ahead. Thank you and goodbye for now.